Welcome to all of you to our webinar entitled The Hope-Filled Persistence of Women in Ministry. I will be your host for today. I'm Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz, the Denominational Minister for Peace and Justice. And I'm joined in this webinar by Amy Zimbelman, who is the Conference Minister for Mountain States Mennonite Conference, and Elizabeth Johnson, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Duke University. Just to let you know that tonight's format and gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. But we will, however, be posting some links in the chats that you'll have access to, and we do welcome your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We had quite a few questions come in. Thank you all for sending those ahead of time, but please feel free to use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. And only the panelists will be able to see your questions, but we'll try and get to as many as we can, as well as the pre-submitted question as time allows. You will also notice in the chat that Spanish translation is available, so please feel free to click on the interpretation on the bottom of your screen button if you need to. Let's start together with prayer. God of light and love, we come before you with hearts filled with gratitude for the women who heed your call to serve in ministry, guided by your strength and grace. And we ask that you continually bless them with courage and perseverance as they navigate the joys and the challenges of their calling. Grant them wisdom and compassion on this journey. May they continue to find inspiration in the stories from those who came before, and may they pave the way for future generations of women in ministry as they move forward in hope and love. Amen. I am going to turn the next piece of time over to Amy and Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Lorraine, and thanks for having us. Welcome to this webinar. We are very much looking forward to sharing some of our research with you all, and we'll be particularly focusing on women in ministry through the years. So in the last few weeks, Elizabeth and I have been reading over interview transcripts and analyzing survey data with this framework in mind. So we will be sharing some brand new findings today. So first, a little bit about why we are doing this study in general. So I got into this work as a woman in ministry myself. I was curious about my own experience and how the joys and the struggles of my work might relate to other women's experiences. I also have a bit of an activist impulse, which got me wondering, can we do a better job in supporting women in MCUSA ministry? So I applied for a grant through the Louisville Institute and received it. And then Elizabeth and I found each other through the Duke and Mennonite grapevines. So she was working on her PhD and was curious about the same topic, and we started collaborating.
So I am not a pastor, but I had heard about the challenges and joys of being a woman in ministry from pastor friends and decided to do a couple interviews about it as a quick grad school class project. That was 2.5 years ago, so it was slightly less quick than I anticipated. But this has now become my dissertation research, and I'm truly thankful to be able to give back to the church by doing work that hopefully makes a difference.
So just so you're aware, this study is funded by MCUSA's Women in Leadership Ministry, no surprise, Duke's Sociology Department, the Louisville Institute, and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. So we're going to start with a few foundations and invitations. This study looked into the experiences of the 329 MCUSA clergywomen who make up 35% of total active licensed pastors. And we've built this project on the foundational understanding that women can and should be pastors. This is for many reasons, but a main one is because the founder of our faith, Jesus, called a woman, Mary Magdalene, to preach the most important sermon of all time, right? He is risen. And so that changed everything. Also, a predecessor to our denomination, General Conference, has ordained women for about half a century. So that's our first foundation. And then we have an invitation for you. You are invited to come to this talk with as much openness as you can muster. So this research focuses on a marginalized group, women in ministry. And so you may feel challenged or uncomfortable, especially if you don't belong to this group. So if you find yourself thinking, well, what about this other group? Or is it really that bad? We would ask you that you kind of set that aside for now and try to hear this presentation on its own terms. And as Lorraine said, we will have some time for Q&A. And then finally, we invite you to please feel free to take a break if necessary. This presentation includes potentially triggering content about violence, including suicide and sexualized violence against women. So please do what you need to in order to protect your well-being. So now I will move on to talking about our research methods. So this project was a mix of qualitative interviews that go in depth in women's stories and a quantitative survey to get kind of a broad nationwide statistical picture of women's and men's experiences. Our youngest female participant was 29 and our oldest was 91. So I took the lead on the qualitative interviews. We interviewed 28 women from every MCUSA conference over Zoom for 1 to 2 hours, and we guaranteed strict confidentiality. We covered about 15 topics in the interview, and we also made sure to overrepresent lesbian, bisexual, and BIPOC women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, due to intersectionality. So we are keenly aware that having multiple marginalized identities compounds mistreatment, right? It can be exponentially more. So these voices are overrepresented compared to the denomination as a whole.
So the quantitative side of this research study comes from the Supporting Pastors Survey, which is a new web-based survey with a questionnaire specially designed for this project. This survey was sent to a nationally representative random sample of active licensed MCUSA clergy of all genders. I will note that some of the data we'll share today is presented in terms of men and women. That's because there are not enough non-binary pastors in our sample for us to report on their answers without breaching confidentiality. Because there's a lot of variation between the experiences of pastors in different ministry settings, the survey focuses on and was sent to pastors in congregational ministry specifically, not folks in other roles like chaplains or seminary professors. So because of the theme we have today of looking at ministry over the generations, most of these analyses that I'll be sharing with you tonight are brand new, not in our previous presentations, and won't just be about our data. I'll also be including comparisons with 2 previous surveys of MCUSA clergy women that took place in 1992 and 2005, administered by Renee Sauter and Diane Zaire-Brenneman, respectively. The last thing that I'll say about survey research is that I'll occasionally mention that something is statistically significant. All that means is that I am really, really sure that it is not due to random chance. I wasn't able to do statistical tests for everything, but when I was, I'll tell you whether it was significant or not. So for more about Amy and I's study, you can go to an FAQ page on the MCUSA website and see other presentations we've given there as well. And I believe that the link for that will be in the chat. So moving on to our central questions. When Amy and I do these presentations, we like to emphasize that job satisfaction for women in ministry is actually really high. Women like their jobs and they want to keep them, even as they're also honest with us about the challenges that they face. In our survey, we found that 96% of women say they are moderately or very satisfied with their work as a pastor. This isn't significantly different from the percentage of men, about 90%, who say the same thing. So gender does not appear to influence job satisfaction. Thanks to previous surveys, we can consider how women's job satisfaction has changed over time. The caveat here is that our question wording is slightly updated from that used in previous surveys, so I would not be able to compare these in an academic paper, but I do feel comfortable sharing this comparison with you today. In our 2023 survey, 96% of women were moderately or very satisfied with their work as a pastor. 18 years ago, in 2005, 82% of women reported that they were satisfied or very satisfied with their pastoral role. 13 years before that, in 1992, only 59% of women reported that they were satisfied or very satisfied with their pastoral role. We don't have data on men in 1992 because the survey that year was only sent to women. So we see a trend over time for women and for men towards greater satisfaction in ministry. Additionally, in 2005, 33% of pastors who took the survey reported that they had sometimes or usually thought seriously about leaving pastoral ministry for some other kind of work in the past year. This is men and women because I don't have the number from the previous survey broken down by gender. In our study, we found that only 26% of our respondents had considered leaving congregational ministry for some other kind of religious or non-religious work fairly often or very often in the past year. Women who took our survey were actually slightly less likely than men to consider leaving congregational ministry, though this wasn't a statistically significant difference. So this further suggests a trend towards greater satisfaction and desire to remain in ministry over the decades.
So now we're going to look a little bit at role models for women in ministry and how that changes or doesn't change over time. So when looking at women in ministry through the years, the women alive today live in this absolutely fascinating window of time in the history of the Anabaptist movement. So we're coming up on 500 years of Anabaptism, of course, and our study has been looking at a little over 6 decades of women, all still alive, born from the 1930s to the 1990s. And we see some unprecedented changes happening in this era. So women born in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s have very few or no role models of women in ministry in their denomination. They have no one or almost no one to look to see how it's done. So here are the words of a participant born in 1955. She says, "I struggled with my pastoral identity. I had absolutely no other role models. I didn't know where to look." So in her case, the couple of women who were ministering among Mennonites weren't church planters, so she had no example of a woman in the role she was taking. If this is how someone born in the 50s felt, you can imagine the women I interviewed born before the 50s had even fewer women in ministry to look to. By the time you get to looking at women born in the 80s, some had amazing role models. I mean, multiple women have their own mother as a role model and colleague in Mennonite ministry when they both become pastors. So that was cool. And one participant who was born in 1983 grew up without female pastor role models, but then when she was 24 years old, everything changed. And so this is a quote from her. She says, "This pastor was the first real flesh and blood example that I had of something I could emulate. She was the first woman pastor I've ever met where I could see myself in her. All the life experiences I've had have confirmed for me the strength of being able to see yourself in someone. That sort of example is just really, really important. And this pastor was that for me. She really nurtured me in my gifts and nurtured me in thinking about pursuing seminary, which I did." So most women said that once they went into ministry, their experience was quite different from their male colleagues' experiences. However, I want to read a quote of a woman who felt like her ministry as a woman was normalized. I want to emphasize there's only one woman I interviewed who felt this sentiment this strongly. So it's not the norm. It's a bit of the unicorn. It's the exception. But a participant born in 1988 said that she had women from other denominations coming to her asking for resources to support women in ministry, like biblical resources. And it took her a while to find them because she hadn't needed them. And so she says, "I've never felt like I have to justify my presence as a woman in ministry. And I'm very aware that that is thanks to the good work that women have already been doing in our denomination. So I have a lot of hope that the new up and coming women pastors will just be able to be themselves as pastors and feel affirmed and challenged and growing in that identity, rather than feeling like being female is a primary definer of their ministry. So this is probably the most fascinating thing that I found when comparing across generations. We go from having women having basically no Mennonite role models, having to be pioneers, to at least one woman saying that her community finds her ministry normal and she doesn't need to justify herself at all. And she connects that, of course, to women before her paving the way. So this is probably the first time in the 499-year history of Anabaptism that a female Anabaptist minister could say that. It really, truly marks a new era, I think. One of the questions submitted ahead of time for this seminar was literally, somebody asked, "How long, O Lord, until the daughters of Zion rejoice?" And so my answer is, maybe it won't take another 499 years. Maybe we're well on the way. So that's hopeful. However, I don't want to get too comfortable. We will talk in this presentation about gender-based harm in ministry, which is still very common, unfortunately. So we do have work to do. I don't want us to sit around, but we have made some real progress.
So one of the questions submitted ahead of time was what tends to hold women back from ministry these days? So let's take a moment to talk about the challenges that women in ministry face. We asked people who took our survey to share what they saw as the top 3 challenges facing people of their gender in ministry today. This was an open-ended question where people could write whatever they wanted. The exact same question was asked in the 2005 survey, so we're able to compare and see how the challenges faced by pastors have changed over time. The top challenge identified by women in 2005 and 2023 was the same: gender inequality. This category included more interpersonal things, like women feeling their voices were taken less seriously because of their gender, women being seen as having less authority than their male counterparts, or women facing persistent sexism that this person commented was ingrained and often generational and came from both men and women. This category also included structural things like receiving lower pay. A pretty common answer was not being considered for lead pastor roles, such as this person who said, "It's fine to be an assistant or an associate, but some congregations do not want a female lead pastor." Several people also talked about not being considered for pastor roles at all in certain congregations or areas, such as this person who said a top challenge for women was not being given an interview due to being a woman, period. The second most common challenge women identified was also the same in both surveys: balancing ministry with family, other roles, and self-care. So a few examples of what this looked like were someone who said that a top challenge was tending to self in the midst of caring for others, and expectations of overwork for pastors make it very difficult for younger women to pastor and raise a family. This was mentioned about 4 times as often by women as by men in our survey, and multiple women noted in their responses that they felt more pressure to be present as a parent than their male spouses and colleagues experienced, such as this respondent, who told us men are given a pass on childcare and running a household, but women must do more to be respected in their career and then also juggle all the home front, or they're seen as less than a good mom/parent. So this inequality in expectations for men and women really compounds the impact of these balance struggles on women's careers. So the third most common challenge identified changed between 2005, when women felt it was challenging to find an effective leadership style, and 2023, when women were more concerned with having supportive relationships with friends, peers, congregants, and conference ministers. Some of the comments people wrote on the survey included not enough female peer support, lack of support from conference ministers, and having friends that I can share with who are not from my congregation. Findings from our qualitative interviews, similarly to this question, suggested that support is often felt to be lacking by women in ministry today. The question, what formal support systems are there to support you, was often met with laughter as a first response. Some comments on this topic in interviews included, "The support I got was what I put into place," "I formed my own support systems," That's been the biggest lack, not just currently, but historically. And it was not conference provided. It was networks and relationships that we as female clergy nurtured or looked for ourselves. And these are only 4 examples of a common recurring theme. So all of this in the survey and the interviews is important because other parts of the survey suggest that having supportive relationships with one's conference minister and congregation is correlated with experiencing fewer forms of harm. So support matters, and therefore the fact that it was named as a key challenge by so many women is troubling. I want to highlight just a few changes and challenges over time that I think are particularly interesting. This is not a list of all changes from 2005 to 2023. There are other ones. One change was that there was greater variety in the challenges that women identified. In 2005, women's answers centered more tightly on a few common responses, while men's answers, in comparison, were much more varied. Now, women's answers are also more spread out, which suggests that there may be greater variety in the challenges individual women in ministry face these days than there were 18 years ago. Besides gender inequality, which was mentioned by around 75% of women, no single answer came up in the majority of responses, which was not the case in 2005. One noteworthy, increasingly common response was cultural challenges, which increased almost 5-fold between surveys, and was actually the most common type of challenge mentioned by men. This was overwhelmingly driven by increasing political polarization and the tensions that brings into congregations. So this quote from a woman illustrates it. The church has widely bought into our country's political polarization and lined up to choose a side. How do we be faithful to Jesus in this context? And this was a really common answer, and some pastors also specifically talked about the influence of COVID and other things on this. So given the current world situation, this may continue to be an increasingly important challenge for pastors in the near future. There are also several challenges that are notable for their absence. In 2005, 11% of women talked about having to respond compassionately to critics of women in ministry, whereas this didn't come up in our data. Women did talk about churches that refuse to hire women and the challenges of doing ecumenical work with denominations that don't ordain women, but no one mentioned having face-to-face conversations with people confronting them about their call to ministry as a top 3 challenge anymore. Also, in 2005, 15% of women identified recognizing one's call and navigating experiences of doubt as one of the top challenges facing women in ministry. We definitely heard these stories in interviews when women described their paths to ministry, but it no longer seems to be a top 3 challenge for people. Finally, to circle back around to what Amy just shared, 12% of clergy women in 2005 brought up the need for role models as a top challenge. In our survey, no one answered the need for role models to this question. So as Amy said, this really marks a new era for women in Mennonite ministry. So that question told us what pastors perceive as the main challenges they face. But there was another particular challenge studied in previous surveys that we wanted to look at as well: sexual harassment. In 1992, 24% of women reported that they had experienced sexual harassment in the congregations where they had served as pastor. By 2005, this had declined to only 17.6% of women and 6.3% of men. In our survey in 2023, this had slightly declined again, but was pretty similar. 15.3% of women and 5.7% of men reported having been sexually harassed in their role as a pastor. However, we knew from doing interviews that some situations are ambiguous and difficult to categorize as being sexual harassment or not. As one interview participant put it, "This is why sexism is so hard, because it's not like someone's like, 'Hey, I love the way your boobs look,' you know? But someone says, 'Oh, that's a great fit of your t-shirt.' And you're just like, 'Wait, what? I don't know. Am I crazy?' It's always so subtle that you can't quite put a finger on it." These ambiguous situations came up in multiple interviews and could also be disruptive and distressing. So to include them, unlike past surveys, we also gave respondents the opportunity to say that they were not sure whether they had been sexually harassed or not in their role as a pastor. As you can see in this graph, 13.3% of women and 2.8% of men said they were unsure whether they'd been sexually harassed. This brings the total number of women currently in ministry who've faced definite or potential sexual harassment in the workplace up to almost 30%. So, sexual harassment may be the most researched form of harm that clergy women face in the workplace, but we know it's not the only form of harm. In interviews, we heard stories about incidents of sexism that didn't constitute sexual harassment, but were nonetheless hurtful, like being mistaken for a pastor's wife or receiving inappropriate remarks on one's appearance. We also heard about non-sexual forms of harm, like being sent bullying messages, people using finances or committees to sabotage a pastor's work, people interfering with a pastor's credentials, or even physically assaulting a pastor. All of these forms of harm contribute on their own and in combination to hurting pastors and potentially driving them out of ministry. These forms of harm weren't just left out of previous research on Mennonite pastors. There are very few research studies of people in any profession that look at things like bullying, sexism, and sexual harassment simultaneously. There are studies of each of these things separately and sometimes in pairs, but usually not in combination with all of them, even though the few studies that have looked at them together have found that they tend to co-occur and that sexist and non-sexual harms can be more common than and equally or more impactful than sexual harassment. I have not been able to find any study of clergy that has looked at all of these forms of harm and how they relate. None of the citations on this slide are about pastors. So I'm deeply grateful to our early interview participants for bringing this to our attention. And I want you to know that the next few slides aren't just new information to us as Mennonites, but new information to the world broadly. So based on interviews, we constructed a list of 18 forms of harm commonly reported by women in ministry and pre-tested it with men and women to make sure that it resonated. This list of behaviors allowed us to go beyond sexual harassment. Also, because people differ in how they define sexual harassment, using a checklist allowed us to get a more objective picture of the kinds of experiences associated with sexual harassment that people in ministry are having, regardless of how they label those experiences. We asked survey respondents to tell us whether, how often, and how recently they'd experienced each form of harm. So this next graph is going to focus on the whether part. I do have a few more slides with graphs. Hang in there. So I do not expect you to read this entire slide. What's important here is that the brown bars are showing the percentage of pastors who have experienced certain non-sexual forms of workplace harm, the pink bars are showing sexist harms, and the blue bars are showing sexual harassment. And of course, there's room for debate because, for example, an inappropriate remark on appearance might be sexist or it might be sexual harassment, depending on what the remark was. But these categories are based on other research on this topic. So on the left, we have women, and on the right, we have men. The asterisks on this graph indicate a form of harm that is significantly more likely to be experienced by that gender. So you can see that for men on the right, those asterisks are concentrated in the non-sexual forms of harm. Men who took the survey were more likely to report having had money or bureaucracy used to control, punish, or sabotage them, and to have received physical threats. On the other hand, for women, you'll see that those asterisks are in the sexual and sexist harassment categories. Compared to men, women were significantly more likely to report having been mistaken for a pastor's spouse, to have been criticized for not conforming to gender roles, to have been pulled into unwanted sexual discussions, and to have been touched in a way that made them uncomfortable. I think what this graph really highlights is that ministry is a difficult profession. It's not the case that women in ministry are harmed and men get off scot-free, but it is true that men and women often face different kinds of harm. And understanding this is important for understanding how to effectively support women in ministry. There are a couple other key takeaways from my analysis of these 18 forms of harm that I want to share with you. One takeaway is that the most common source of almost every single one of these forms of harm is lay people. This is not surprising, as the 1992 and 2005 surveys both found that lay people were the most common source of sexual harassment. But it is new information that this is true of these other forms of harm targeting pastors as well. The fact that lay people are often the source of harm complicates our ability as a denomination to respond, since conferences and congregations can't necessarily fire lay people or make them attend healthy boundaries training. But there are still some things that leaders can do, and we talked about some of these with conference ministers when Amy and I created a training workshop for the conference minister gathering in Banff last fall. The second is that different forms of harm tend to occur together. So I used a research method called cluster analysis to group people together who had had similar experiences of harm. This helped me to identify which patterns of harm go together and tend to happen to the same people, and reveals different profiles of harm experienced by pastors in the real world. So again, you don't need to read everything on this graph. I just want you to see that in none of these profiles are people experiencing only sexual harassment. People in the first profile, who are almost entirely men, are experiencing a lot of non-sexual harm, but not really any sexual harassment at all. So if you're a man listening to this webinar who was really surprised at how high the rates of sexual harassment are, maybe you belong in profile 1. The other profiles, which contain more women, do include sexual harassment, but they include a lot of sexism and non-sexual harms too. There is no profile where sexual harassment occurs without sexism and non-sexual harms also happening. I don't have a way of knowing what chronological order these experiences happened in, but if future research finds out that less severe forms of harm are happening first, then that would mean that we can intervene when we see less severe forms of harm happening and prevent more serious forms of harm from ever taking place. This also means that while we only have data on sexual harassment from previous surveys, it's probably safe for us to hypothesize that these other forms of harm were taking place also. Finally, my last key takeaway is that these other forms of harm are also impactful. You may have been asking yourself for the last few minutes, do sexist comments really matter? Isn't being touched inappropriately or physically threatened much worse than having someone criticize you for not conforming to gender stereotypes? So to answer this, we asked people about a variety of outcomes like health, job satisfaction, and thoughts of leaving ministry. So recently, I've been using these 18 harm items to create models to try to predict what a woman's outcomes will be based on her experiences. Of these 3 categories of harm, the only category that I've found can accurately predict these outcomes is sexism. Women who'd experienced more forms of sexism over the course of their careers had lower job satisfaction, were more overwhelmed at their jobs, were more likely to consider leaving their congregations, congregational ministry, or religious work entirely, and were less happy and satisfied in general. These relationships are statistically significant. Looking only at the past year, which means there's a much smaller amount of harms we're looking at compared to someone's whole career, which makes it harder for things to be statistically significant. Recent experiences of sexism are also, again, significantly associated with feeling overwhelmed by one's job and considering leaving congregational ministry or religious work entirely. So here is, once again, that graph of men's and women's experiences. Those pink bars, those way too high pink bars, were the best predictor of women's job satisfaction and thoughts of leaving ministry. So it is important for us to consider forms of harm besides sexual harassment, and to not underestimate the impact that things like sexist comments can have on someone's career. Again, the best predictor of thinking of leaving ministry and feeling satisfied in one's job. So in keeping with our theme of generations, while I don't have the data from previous surveys to compare this list of items with, we do have survey data from people with varying ages and experience levels. And the pattern that we see in our data is that age matters. In the present day, younger women and women who entered ministry more recently, which often go together, tend to have experienced significantly more forms of harm in the past year. Looking more broadly, what matters even more for the women in our sample than what year they started ministry is what age they were when they started ministry. Women who started ministry at younger ages tend to have experienced significantly more forms of harm during their careers, whether those careers began in 1980 or 2010. So if you are in a position of leadership working with a young woman entering ministry, please be supportive because she might encounter more pushback and harm as a leader than an older person would. But she also might have different tools for responding to that harm than someone from another generation might have. And I will turn it back over to Amy to share more about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to share a little bit about attitudes and responses to harm that women had, especially from my qualitative data. So since harm happens to women across the board, they, of course, have to find ways to cope. And so I'm going to survey what that looks like. So some women absorb harm, usually out of necessity. As one 70-year-old put it, she says, if I were a feminist speaking up, I would not be here. So in other words, she would not have survived long in ministry if she directly stood up for herself because the environments she served in were so unsafe. Compare that to very direct communication that a younger woman could have. One 34-year-old participant said, a congregant made a sexual joke, and I was like, nope, you may not talk to me like that. I don't want to hear that again. And he apologized right away. So this level of confrontation was really rare because it requires such a great deal of psychological safety to speak so directly. This woman counted the cost and felt secure that this man and the community surrounding him would not retaliate or blame her. And she was right. But we unfortunately heard many more examples of women of all ages being punished or even pushed out of ministry for standing up for themselves or others. So not every environment is that safe. So women from every generation often responded creatively and indirectly to their mistreatment, such as using humor, especially sass, or communicating with another leader about the person who harmed them, or setting up a new support system for themselves. And then sometimes the response was to leave. Among my interviews, there did seem to be more younger women willing or able to leave a position because of harm. In some cases, it was likened to leaving an abusive marriage, unfortunately. One pastor in her early 30s got to the point of being suicidal when she walked into church. And she realized that God probably didn't want her to kill herself, so she resigned. While I didn't see a stark difference between generations in attitudes towards harm, I think there are too many variables to really have a solid statement on that. Sometimes women in the study themselves would describe some generational differences in attitudes. So I'm going to read one of those. And you may have heard this from one of our earlier presentations. This one gets quoted back to us a lot. One woman in her late 30s said, when reporting mistreatment, the response I got from other women in ministry was, yes, I've been through something like that. There were a few older women whose responses were just like, well, that's just part of it. That's just the dues we pay. That's just being a woman in ministry. I wouldn't say they were dismissive of me per se, but they were just like, yeah, it happens. And now it happened to you. As though I were a rugby player and had broken my leg for the first time. It's not that they were insensitive to the fact that my leg was broken. They were just like, well, yeah, you play rugby, your leg's going to get broken. You have gone through this rite of passage, as have we all. So in all this, in the harm and the responding to harm, women are trying to cope the best they can with whatever comes their way and the tools they have. And it, of course, doesn't serve us well to blame or shame anyone for their responses to difficulties. However, I will say that at the end of the day, studies show that it's better for our institutions if we all have a lower tolerance for abuse and harassment. So the best attitude we can collectively have is, yes, women in ministry have experienced harm through the years. It wasn't okay then. It's not okay now, right? In fact, as we've shared elsewhere, the single biggest predictor of sexual harassment on the job is how permissive an organization is of sexual harassment, right? So we all send cues of what behavior is acceptable and what isn't when we do life together. I think Cammie's going to post the article in the chat, the citation. So many of you all listening here are in positions to say something when you see harm of any kind in our churches. So if you're a leader, that voice becomes all the more important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of support. We've mentioned this already, but we're going to go a little deeper on this. So I've written an article about support structures, but I also want to name the impact that an individual can have when supporting a woman in ministry and how important that is. So one pastor talked about a positive change that occurred when someone stood up for her. So here's the situation that she describes. As far as my experiences with lead pastor, who was her colleague, there were multiple times in pastor-elder team meetings where he would literally silence me. I would start to say something and he'll go, shh. I'd start to say something again and he'd go, shh, completely silenced me. And the elders would just sit there like, we don't know what to do right now. And the meeting would go on. When a new elder joined who was a psychologist, the pastor says, there was one time we were having a meeting and I said something and the lead pastor just yelled at me very aggressively. His tone of voice and intonation and everything pounced on me verbally. The new elder, who was also a counselor, was like, whoa, wait a second. He was like, participant, the women in ministry, how did that feel? And I was like, oh my word, what happened here? People are actually doing something, right? So this quote is about someone finally stood up to this woman in ministry's abusive colleague, and it changed the dynamics for her. So one of the questions that we had submitted ahead of time was, how can our churches address the remaining inequities and specific challenges for women today? So you are in luck because we have all the answers at this webinar. Okay, maybe not, but there are some things that I would advocate for in our churches, some bigger picture ways of helping in this whole goal of having women in ministry have wonderful experiences. So one is changing the culture through those small acts, those interventions, like the story I just described. We also need to harness the leadership will to make big structural changes, things like HR policies and practices that can promote women, things like family leave, yay. We can develop the next generation of leaders, right? Like who gets mentored and do they have what they need to succeed? And then we can promote a theology, sermons, book studies that work against oppression in all its forms, such as ways of talking about God that aren't strictly male. Addressing inequalities with this multi-pronged approach is not just good for us now. I believe it could make a difference for the next 500 years of women in Anabaptist ministry. And so to close this part of our presentation, I want to share some quotes directly from women of what they hope for. And it's specifically what they hope for the future of women in ministry. And so when I asked this question in my interviews, there were kind of different categories that the hopes fell under. And so one category was an increase in celebrating diversity, including that we'd have more diverse leadership. Another category was that women in ministry would just be normalized. That's their hope. Women also just hoped for liberation. Women hoped for our church structures to experience reform. Women were hoping that future pastors would have less self-doubt that they struggled with, and then that future generations would just have it easier was another hope. So I'm going to give like one brief quote for each of these. So for diversity, she just said, my hope is for diversity, the welcoming of diversity, pretty simple. For women in ministry being normalized, she hopes that there continue to be spaces for women to step into and not be tokenized. Oh, we have a woman, but more like we're hiring her because she would be a wonderful pastor or a wonderful conference minister, seeing people as their whole selves and not just as women. For liberation, my hope is that we would be free to be who God created us to be and have open doors for that, affirming open doors, rather than having to jump hoops to get where we want to be. And I think we're on that path. And then for reforming church structures, one woman in ministry said, Phyllis Tickle talks about every 500 years, there's a renewal reformation of the church, and we are there. I think that if we continue doing church the way we always have, we're going to continue to die out. And I think people are searching for new and different ways to do and to be church. I see women as being the cutting edge of that, not being limited to the structures and traditions of the past, being creative, and having church be more about connection and relationship, more participatory, and less about one person up front talking at us. For improvements, or for less self-doubt, my hope for all women in ministry is that we'll do less of that. And she was referring to agonizing. We'll do less agonizing when we are indeed called to some kind of ministry, and we'll just claim it and embrace it and live it. And then for future generations, I really love that my 2 nieces and my nephew are all growing up with me as an example. They all know that whatever their gender, when they grow up and whatever vocational path they choose, that women can be pastors. So before I turn it over to Q&A with Lorraine, I want to take a second for some thank yous so we don't miss these. I want to say thank you to our funders, including Women in Leadership through MCUSA. Thank you so much for everyone who supported us, local conference staff, and especially MCUSA national staff. Thank you to those who participated in the study, some of whom I know are listening here today. It's been an honor to hear and hold your stories and to be in this together. And thanks for showing up today for those who are here. So lots of thank yous. I will turn it over to Lorraine.
Elizabeth and Amy, thank you so much. Thank you, one, for all of the work that you've put into this just to date. I know that it hasn't been quick, it hasn't been easy, nor should it be, but that you have done an amazing job. And every time I hear you talking about it, I am more appreciative of what you're providing to the church, to women through this research and through what comes of it, and how we can continue to have conversations and how it impacts what we do. So thank you again for all of that. But I want us to also, we have a few minutes just to take some questions. And so I want to make sure we get to that. There are some specifically that we talked about responding to, but I also want to look at what has come in. Someone commented that they remembered at the MenoCon presentation that there was a bit of discussion on the difference ordination makes for women's experience of pastoring. So licensed not towards ordination, licensed towards ordination, or ordained. Is there more that either one of you would want to say about that?
Yeah, I can share a little bit about that. So that for folks who weren't at that presentation, what we found is that the women who have experienced the highest rates of different forms of harm in the past 12 months were not the women who were already ordained or the women who were not seeking ordination, but specifically those in the ordination process. And the same relationship was there for men, but just a little bit less, so it wasn't quite statistically significant. So yes, that is not actually just confined to Mennonites either. I've done interviews with Episcopalians and have also heard there that the ordination process is a particularly vulnerable time for people in ministry, and that in interviews has been identified as a consequence of power dynamics, where during the ordination process, the ordinand does not have a lot of power, and there are many, many people who have power over them. So that is another part of someone's career, definitely, that is worth paying attention to, and offering some extra support and affirmation, and yeah, trying to make that experience as like fair and smooth as possible for women seeking ordination.
A second question that came in, what percent, and I know you talked about this some earlier on about overrepresentation of BIPOC women. Do you have, what percent were women of color, and were their sense of safety considered?
Was their sense of safety considered? Oh, like how we conducted the interviews, they mean, I think. Okay. Let me do for my part. So for my part, women of color were 17.8% of the interviews. and that is higher than credentialed women of color in MCUSA. It is tricky because there are many women of color who do not have that credential. So we just had to work with that. Yeah, and then we were definitely considering interviews, interview questions that were not themselves triggering. Duke's IRB, Internal Review Board, looked over and approved our interview questions. And so sometimes we would ask like broad questions such as, have you experienced, is intersectionality a part of your experience, or something like that, that then folks could answer or not, if they didn't want to go into that. So yeah, we were very cognizant about that. And I was so grateful that we could interview a diversity of voices, because there were definitely experiences that were unique to women of color, and struggles that did seem to be greater. And so from my end, I felt like the eye towards intersectionality was definitely affirmed.
So another question that came previously is, how do you start a successful conversation with someone resistant to the idea that they have privilege?
Yeah. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I can, or you can. I think that this question is, it's broader than our research, but there are aspects of our research that can speak to this. So one thing that I would love to share about from the survey is I was surprised by the number of responses from men to that 3 challenges question that said that the most pressing, one of the top 3 challenges in ministry for men was learning to be cognizant of their power as men or as white men, and learning to share power, and learning to lift up and empower other people who were marginalized. Sometimes specifically talking about women in ministry, but sometimes speaking more broadly about that. And so there was a real awareness of power and privilege. And there was an awareness among some men who replied of the limited role that men need to take, and the fact that sometimes encouraging others to step up into leadership roles means stepping back, and the grief that goes along with that, but also in their responses affirmed that they saw the value of that and were aware of that trade-off. And so I do think, based on those responses, that there are a lot of spaces where men are already having these conversations, or maybe not having conversations, but at least internally are very aware of privilege and power dynamics. And so my hope is that that isn't just a conversation that women need to start, but that's a conversation that men are equipped to have among themselves and to initiate with others as well, because of those really thoughtful survey responses we saw.
Yeah, and to just add to that, the question is kind of how to start a conversation. And what I saw in the qualitative data was that oftentimes conversation, debating about Timothy or debating about Paul in the Bible wasn't very helpful. And what was most helpful was folks who were not affirming of women in ministry, watching a woman in ministry do her thing for years and say, oh my gosh, I was so wrong. And that there were a surprising number of stories that I've written an article about this, of stories of people, men and women, changing their minds and saying, oh, women not only can be ministers, but they're fantastic at it. And how did I ever doubt this? And I'm sorry, apologizing directly to women in ministry. And so I think that comes down to relationship, right? We can debate till we're blue in the face, but oftentimes relationship is the most powerful.
Thank you. Another question was, how are women leaders being called or finding their call to ministry? What have you heard?
So I think that in There's a term that I love in the sociology of religion that I think we saw reflected in the interviews. There's a concept of the vertical call and the horizontal call. So the vertical call is the call from God, and the horizontal call is the call from others around you seeing your call to ministry and affirming your gifts. And so I think Amy can speak a bit more about how both of those showed up in interviews.
Yeah, so there were many ways that women found themselves in ministry. And some would be things like they started in seminary in the academic route and then realized, oh, I actually want to be a pastor. This happened a few times. Women would fill in for men in ministry when the men were out sick or, longer term. And then everyone realizes, oh, wow, she has gifts for ministry and hires her on. Very, very common, probably the most common was being tapped on the shoulder by church leaders, spouses, loved one. Sometimes there was one woman who was tapped on the shoulder by both her mom and I believe her brother-in-law, and neither of them thought women should be in ministry, but they both thought she should be in ministry. So sometimes you'd see that well, overall, I don't agree with this, but you're amazing, so you should go for it. And then at least 5 or 6 of my interviews included miracles or mystical experiences. A couple were when folks were children, so they would have dreams as children or feel a hand on their shoulder and attributed it to God because there was no one there, or just a voice and then saying, okay, I'll do it. I'll become a pastor someday. Lots of very, very cool mystical experiences that people shared. So I also have that in one of the articles that I've written, a few of those. And so, yeah, those were some, I kind of have tried to analyze the mystical experiences, and I do wonder if there's so much self-doubt and there's so much cultural resistance to women being in ministry that it almost takes something miraculous for them to believe it themselves, that they could move forward with this career and with this calling. So that's kind of a theory I have about that. So yeah.
Almost that feeling of, if you can do anything else but, and
Right.
try and do that, but this is where it feels like they're supposed to be. And that's,
Right.
I love those stories. Here's a question about barriers. What barriers have you faced and how have you dealt with them?
Well, that's fun. You should probably ask my husband, Matt. He has supported me through everything. Yeah, so I'll answer this just as a woman in ministry. I have faced plenty of internal barriers like self-doubt. And then in reading the 18 categories of harm that we have in our survey, I've experienced a good deal of those, a majority of those. So yeah, kind of the sexual harassment, the bullying about my pregnancy, all the microaggressions, like every single one, some choice names, some abuse that was bad enough that my husband and I were afraid for me to go to work. So a lot. I have experienced a lot. And I don't always share about it. But I do still love serving the church, and believe it or not, I am not masochistic or lacking self-respect. I don't like being harmed, but at the end of the day, I have never had a job that so uses my skills, that brings me as much joy as pastoring does, as conference ministry does. It is so meaningful. And so I really do, despite all the things, I really do have high job satisfaction, like the women in our survey. And I think for me, the question was kind of how have you dealt with the struggles? For me, I would say I am only able to thrive because of the fantastic fellow leaders surrounding me in ministry. So there are folks that I have their back, they have my back. An example for me was like a few years ago, I reported some harm that happened to me as a conference minister. And our moderator, our ministerial council, Michael Danner, they did not doubt me. They didn't blame me. They took the harm seriously. We dealt with it. They intervened in ways that were very helpful. And I think that as a pastor, like, you can self-care until you're blue in the face, and you should self-care. But if you don't have support, things might not get better, right? And so I truly feel completely indebted to fellow leaders for my career and for the support outside of my career as well, of friends and family. And so I'm very hopeful, I will say that, with some of the new policies, with what Nancy Kaufman is up to with safe churches, with some of the new misconduct things. I hope that protections in our churches won't be as personality dependent on whatever leaders are around and how well they understand power dynamics. Like, that worries me. Because at the end of the day, like, I, at least, one of the reasons I got into this is because these are justice issues we're talking about, right? This is about workers' rights. This is about women's equality. This is about unchecked violence in our churches. And so we do need more protections, and whoever will listen to me, I will talk their ear off about that. So I don't know, Lorraine lets me do webinars, so you must not be too annoyed at me.
I love these webinars.
Good.
I know, I know we're maybe a little bit over time, and I want to pay attention to that. But one final question, and maybe this relates to what you were just talking about, Amy, in terms of your experience. But how do women find their people? How to just that support, those who will support them, that gives them longevity in ministry? How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is luck. I mean, for me, I feel like some of the leaders in my conference are fantastic, and that I got really lucky. But I think, I mean, I'm jealous of women in Mennonite Meccas, right? Like the Goshen Elkhart area, they have women's pastors groups, not just pastors groups. And because there's a critical mass in certain parts of the country, that's amazing. Take advantage of that if you live there. Women in Leadership does events, the Women Doing Theology conferences. There are ecumenical groups, Young Clergy Women International for the under 40 crowd. Seminaries sometimes have groups of, support groups. Really being intentional to find mentors, to find friends. Like, I have friends, childhood friends I hang out with almost every week, who are not and are never going to go to Mennonite churches, and that is super helpful as well. Therapy was mentioned by a lot of the women in our study as well, as a way to talk about what they're going through each week. But I think this is a great question, and I don't think I can fully answer it. And so I would love it, because there were, like, in the pre-asked questions, there were multiple people asking questions along these lines of how do we connect with each other, with other women in ministry. So feel free to email me and give me your ideas, like what might help. I don't want to start a national book club or something if that's not actually what's needed. But I'd be happy to listen to ideas and see what bubbles up. And you can also email Lorraine if you want. I'm signing you up for more work. No,
Yeah.
you can email me. I will take your email.
I think that, to build on that, one thing that we've talked about, Amy, is the need for conversations between women in different generations of ministry, because of some of the tensions, like in the rugby quote, and creating spaces for women of different generations to come together and to, like, validate each other's struggles and work, and to find healing through that.
Yeah. And I just thought one more thing too that I'm really big on is the importance of local church leaders. So the church chair, the church board, they can make or break a woman's ministry, and I've seen it a lot. If they are cognizant of what's going on, if they address harm when it happens, if they understand some basics of HR, because they're functioning as the HR department, really, then that can be huge for supporting women. And if they are not sure what to do, or they're good people, they're volunteers, they're doing it because they care, but sometimes they aren't sure what to do. And so I am advocating for whatever trainings we can have for church boards, for the elders groups, whatever every church calls them a different thing, but basically the local leaders, because people want to do the right thing, and I think a lot of times they're not sure how to respond to things that happen in our churches. So yeah, I hope MCUSA, I hope other organizations, AMBF, whoever, does more trainings for church boards.
Well, again, I want to thank you both. We could keep going, that. We could probably do these webinars weekly and we wouldn't run out of topics. And I think it's so helpful. And I think, we talk about women in leadership as being part of it is part of our church vitality. It is part of our peace and justice. It's all of that for a reason. And so having these conversations, I think, are so helpful. So thank you. On that note, I do want to say that there is going to be a second webinar that will be April 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So mark that on your calendars. And there will be more information coming out about what that webinar is going to include, but having more conversations like this, I think, is so critical. And again, be sure, if you haven't, I think we just put that in the chat, sign up for Piecemeal, MCUSA's weekly e-newsletter. That's also a great way to get information about what's upcoming and what's happening within MCUSA. So thank you to all who participated. Elizabeth and Amy, thank you again for being with us, and we look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lorraine.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions. I typed back to a couple that we didn't get to.
Yes, thank you.
They were great.